Married off to the reclusive Duke no lady wanted, she became the envy of all London. After 4 seasons without a single proposal, Amber Cartwright was being dressed for a wedding to a man she'd never met. Could a marriage born of desperation become something more? What happened next changed everything for her. Hello my lovely listeners. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you can, kindly tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It always brings a smile to my face knowing where in the world my stories get to. Let's continue with our story. Amber Cartwright stood before the mirror in her bedchamber, her maid Rose fastening the buttons of her wedding gown. The dress was simple cream silk, bought quickly and without ceremony. There had been no time for proper fittings, no excited discussions about lace or ribbons. Her father had received the Duke's letter only 3 weeks ago, and now here she was, being prepared to marry a stranger. "You look lovely, miss," Rose said softly, though her eyes held pity. Amber stared at her reflection and saw what London society had always seen. A plain face with gentle brown eyes, dark hair pulled back simply, and a figure that was neither tall nor graceful. She was 22 years old and had spent 4 seasons watching other girls dance while she sat with the chaperones. 4 seasons of whispered comments and turned backs. Too plain for marriage, they'd said at her very first ball. She'd heard it again and again until the words became a truth she carried in her heart. Her father's voice called from downstairs, sharp with impatience. Geoffrey Cartwright had spent a fortune on her seasons, and she'd failed him completely. No offers, no prospects, nothing but mounting debts and social embarrassment. When the Duke of Ashford's letter arrived, offering marriage with a minimal dowry and no courtship, her father had accepted within hours. "At least you'll be a duchess," he'd told her coldly. "That's more than we ever hoped for." Amber knew what he really meant. At least she'd be gone, no longer a burden on the household. At least the shame would end. The small parish church felt empty despite the 20 guests scattered across the pews. Amber walked down the aisle alone, her father having already taken his seat. There would be no tender moment of him giving her away, no tears of joy. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. At the altar stood Julian Cromwell, Duke of Ashford. He was taller than she'd expected, dressed in his military uniform rather than formal wedding attire. His light brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his hazel eyes looked past her rather than at her. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clasped too tightly behind his back. This man did not want to be here any more than she did. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Amber barely heard the words. She was too aware of the Duke beside her, of the stiffness in his posture, of the way he never once looked directly at her face. When it came time for their vows, he spoke clearly but without warmth. "I, Julian Cromwell, take thee, Amber Cartwright, to be my wedded wife." His voice was deep and steady, like a soldier reporting for duty. Amber repeated her own vows, her voice barely above a whisper. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian did not kiss her. He simply nodded once and turned toward the vestry to sign the register. The wedding breakfast was held at her father's townhouse, a brief and awkward affair. Geoffrey Cartwright looked relieved, already calculating how much money he would save without her. The few guests who attended spoke in hushed tones, clearly uncomfortable. Charlotte Cromwell, Julian's sister-in-law, approached Amber with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was beautiful in an icy way, dressed in the latest fashion with perfect blonde curls. "How practical of Julian to finally marry," Charlotte said, her tone suggesting anything but approval. "I'm sure you'll manage the household well enough. Ashford Hall has been without a proper mistress for years. It needs someone who understands their place." Amber understood perfectly. She was being told she was beneath them, that she should be grateful for this opportunity, that she should remain invisible. Julian's brother Frederick stood nearby, a handsome man who looked nothing like the Duke. Where Julian was quiet and withdrawn, Frederick was all charm and easy smiles. He shook Julian's hand with forced enthusiasm. "Congratulations, brother. Perhaps now mother will stop pestering you about duty and heirs." Julian said nothing, simply nodded again. Amber noticed how he kept his distance from everyone, how his eyes constantly moved to the windows as if planning an escape. This was a man who did not want to be around people, who found social gatherings painful rather than pleasant. After an hour, Julian stood abruptly. "We should depart. The journey to Ashford will take most of the day." No one protested. Her father looked positively relieved. Amber gathered her few belongings, packed quickly into 2 small trunks. Everything she owned in the world fit into 2 trunks. It seemed fitting somehow. The carriage that waited outside was well-made but old-fashioned, with the Ashford crest faded on the door. Julian helped her inside with careful courtesy, but he did not sit beside her. Instead, he took the opposite seat, leaving a proper distance between them. As the carriage rolled through London streets, Amber watched the familiar buildings pass by. She was leaving the only home she'd ever known, going to a place she'd never seen, with a man she didn't understand. Fear and sadness mixed together in her chest until she thought she might cry. But she didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Julian sat across from her in silence, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. His hands rested on his knees, but she noticed how his fingers occasionally twitched, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. After nearly an hour of complete silence, he finally spoke. "I should explain the arrangement," he said, his voice formal and distant. "Ashford Hall is isolated, located on the moorlands of Yorkshire. We have few visitors and hold no social events. I do not entertain, nor do I attend functions in London." Amber nodded, unsure what to say. "Your duties will include managing the household and, if you're willing, overseeing the estate accounts. The steward, Percival Harrington, will assist you. Beyond that, your time is your own. I will not intrude upon your privacy or make demands upon you." She understood what he meant. This would be a marriage in name only. Relief and loneliness washed over her in equal measure. She would be safe from unwanted attention, but she would also be utterly alone. "I understand, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Julian," he corrected, though his tone remained distant. "You may call me Julian when we are private. We are married now, after all." But the way he said it made it clear that being married changed nothing between them. They were 2 strangers bound by law and nothing more. The countryside grew wilder as they traveled north. Green fields gave way to rough grasslands, and the sky seemed larger somehow, more open and empty. Amber watched the landscape change and felt herself moving further from everything she'd known. By late afternoon, they'd left the main roads behind, following narrow lanes that wound between low stone walls. Julian had fallen silent again, but she noticed how his body tensed whenever they passed through wooded areas. His jaw would clench, his breathing would quicken slightly, and his hand would move to his side as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Something had happened to him, something that left him watching the shadows with wary eyes. As the sun began to set, the carriage climbed a final hill, and Amber saw Ashford Hall for the first time. It rose from the moorland like a dark fortress, an old Elizabethan manor built of grey stone. Parts of it looked grand, with tall windows and elegant architecture, but other sections showed neglect. Some windows were shuttered, the gardens were overgrown, and ivy crept unchecked up the walls. It looked like a house that had been forgotten by the world. "Welcome to Ashford Hall," Julian said, and for the first time, she heard something other than coldness in his voice. It was resignation, perhaps, or sadness. "It's not what it once was, but it's home." The carriage stopped before the main entrance, and servants appeared to help with the trunks. They greeted Julian with obvious respect and warmth, which surprised Amber. Whatever the London gossip said about the reclusive Duke, his own people seemed to care for him. An older man with kind eyes stepped forward and bowed. "Your Grace, welcome home." "And welcome to you, Your Grace," he said to Amber. "I'm Percival Harrington, steward of Ashford Hall. We're honored to have a duchess in residence again." His welcome felt genuine, unlike the cold politeness she'd received from Julian's family. Amber found herself grateful for his kindness. Julian led her inside through a great hall that must have once been magnificent. Now it felt empty, with dust covers on furniture and paintings dark with age. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floors. He brought her up a grand staircase to the second floor and down a long corridor lit by flickering candles. "These will be your chambers," he said, opening a door to reveal a suite of rooms that took her breath away. The sitting room was elegant and surprisingly well maintained, with tall windows overlooking the moorland. Beyond it was a bedchamber with a large four-poster bed and a dressing room. Everything was clean and prepared for her arrival, with fresh flowers on the table and a fire burning in the grate. She noticed a connecting door on one wall. Julian followed her gaze and spoke quickly. "That leads to my apartments. The lock is on your side only. I hope you'll find comfort and privacy here. You need not fear any intrusion from me." He said it as if he were reassuring a frightened child, and perhaps that's what she was. A frightened girl in a strange house with a strange man. "Thank you," she managed to say. "It's lovely." Julian nodded once, that same sharp movement she was beginning to recognize. "Dinner will be at 8, if you wish to join me. Or I can have a tray sent to your room if you prefer solitude. There is no obligation either way." Before she could answer, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Amber stood alone in her new chambers, in her new home, married to a man who seemed to want nothing to do with her. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt more invisible than ever. She moved to the window and looked out at the wild moorland stretching endlessly under the darkening sky. Somewhere out there was London, where people whispered about plain Miss Cartwright who'd been married off to the reclusive Duke no lady wanted. They would say she got what she deserved, that she should be grateful for any husband at all. But standing in this beautiful room in this lonely house, Amber wondered if perhaps she and the Duke were not so different. Perhaps they were both people the world had decided to overlook, to dismiss, to forget. Perhaps that's why they'd ended up here together, two unwanted souls in an unwanted marriage. She didn't go down to dinner that night. Instead, she asked Rose to bring a tray to her room, and she ate alone by the fire, listening to the wind howl across the moors. Tomorrow she would begin learning to be a duchess. Tonight, she would simply try to accept that her old life was truly over, and whatever came next was a mystery she couldn't yet imagine. The carriage wheels turned steadily northward, carrying Amber away from everything she'd ever known. Mile after mile, London's familiar streets gave way to open countryside, then to rougher terrain dotted with sheep and stone walls. The land grew wilder, emptier, as if they were traveling not just through space but into another world entirely. Julian sat across from her in silence, his tall frame rigid against the seat. He gazed out the window with the fixed attention of a soldier on watch, his hazel eyes tracking every shadow, every movement. Amber studied him carefully when he wasn't looking. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, that spoke of constant vigilance. This was not a man at ease. When they passed through wooded areas, she noticed how his hands gripped the edge of the seat until his knuckles turned white. His jaw would clench, and his breathing would change, becoming shallow and controlled. At sudden sounds, a bird taking flight, a branch snapping, he would flinch almost imperceptibly before catching himself. What had happened to him? What had the war done to make him react this way? After nearly 2 hours of silence, Julian finally spoke. His voice was low and measured, as if he'd been rehearsing the words in his mind. "I should be honest with you about what kind of life awaits at Ashford Hall. I am not skilled at social gatherings or polite conversation. I will not ask you to entertain guests or host dinners. Those days are long past for me." Amber nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Your duties will be managing the household, if you're willing. The steward will help with anything you need. Beyond that, your time belongs to you. Read, walk the grounds, pursue whatever interests you have. I will not interfere." She understood what he was really saying. He would leave her alone. They would live separate lives under the same roof, bound by marriage but nothing more. It should have been a relief, but instead it felt like another kind of rejection. "I will not impose upon you," Julian added quietly, meeting her eyes for the first time that day. "I require a duchess for practical reasons, nothing more. You need not fear any demands from me." There it was. The arrangement laid bare. She was to be a duchess in name, a keeper of his household, but never truly his wife. Would this lonely existence be her future? Or could two overlooked souls find something more in the isolation of Ashford Hall? Ashford Hall appeared on the horizon like a ghost from another age. The sprawling Elizabethan manor rose from the moorland in grey stone, its many chimneys reaching toward heavy clouds. Amber pressed closer to the carriage window, taking in her new home. Parts of it were magnificent, with tall mullioned windows and elegant stonework that spoke of former glory. But other sections showed clear neglect: shuttered windows, ivy creeping unchecked up entire walls, gardens that had grown wild and untamed. It looked like a place that had been slowly forgotten by the world. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, and servants emerged to greet them. They moved with practiced efficiency but also with something else Amber hadn't expected: genuine warmth toward their master. A middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes stepped forward, bowing respectfully. "Your Grace, welcome home. And welcome to Ashford Hall, Your Grace," he said to Amber with a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm Percival Harrington, steward of this estate. We're truly honored to have a duchess in residence again after all these years." His welcome felt sincere, so different from the cold politeness she'd received in London. Amber found herself returning his smile, grateful for this small kindness. Julian led her through the great hall, their footsteps echoing on ancient stone floors. Dust covers draped over furniture like shrouds, and portraits of long-dead Cromwells watched from darkened walls. The house felt hollow, as if it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for life to return. Up the grand staircase they went, down a long corridor lit by afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Julian stopped before a carved oak door and pushed it open. "These are your chambers," he said simply. Amber stepped inside and caught her breath. Unlike the rest of the house, these rooms were beautifully maintained. The sitting room held elegant furniture in shades of blue and cream, with tall windows overlooking the wild moorland. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the writing desk, and a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Beyond was a spacious bedchamber with a four-poster bed draped in soft linens, and a dressing room already prepared for her modest belongings. Someone had taken great care to make this space welcoming. Had Julian arranged this himself? Her eyes found the connecting door on the far wall. Julian followed her gaze and spoke quietly. "That leads to my apartments. The lock is on your side only. I hope you'll find comfort here, and privacy as well." He left before she could thank him, the door closing with a soft click that seemed to seal her into this new life. The first week at Ashford Hall passed in strange, dreamlike isolation. Julian disappeared for hours each day, walking the estate grounds alone or shut away in his study. Amber saw him only at dinner, where they ate in near silence at opposite ends of a table meant for 20. He was unfailingly polite but distant, as if she were a guest he felt obligated to acknowledge rather than his wife. So Amber began to explore her new home, wandering through corridors and rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. She found a music room with a pianoforte covered in dust, ballrooms where no one had danced in years, and a conservatory where plants had long since died from neglect. The house felt like a monument to abandonment, beautiful but lifeless. Then she discovered the library. It was tucked away in the east wing, a vast room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with thousands of volumes. Military histories sat beside philosophical treatises, botanical studies next to poetry collections, travel journals alongside scientific texts. This was clearly where Julian spent his time. A fire burned in the grate, and recent books lay open on reading tables. For the first time since arriving at Ashford Hall, Amber felt she might have found something worth holding on to. But would the Duke who owned these books ever share them with her? Or would she remain forever locked outside his world, a duchess in name but a stranger in truth? On the 8th day of her residence at Ashford Hall, Amber was curled in one of the library's deep leather chairs, completely absorbed in a volume of Locke's essays on human understanding. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, and for the first time since arriving, she felt almost content. Here, surrounded by thousands of books, she didn't feel quite so alone. The door opened suddenly. Julian stepped inside, then froze when he saw her. His expression shifted through surprise to what looked like embarrassment, and he began to retreat. "Please don't go on my account," Amber said quickly, closing her book. "It's your library after all." He hesitated in the doorway, clearly torn between leaving and staying. After a long moment, he moved slowly toward the shelves, keeping a careful distance from where she sat today. His eyes scanned the spines of books as if searching for something specific, but Amber suspected he was simply giving himself something to do with his hands. "You read philosophy?" he asked finally, glancing at the volume in her lap. "And history and poetry as well, though I was always told such interests were impractical for a woman." Something changed in his face then, a subtle softening around his eyes. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," Amber said simply. "My governess, my father, the other young ladies during the season. They said I should focus on accomplishments that would attract a husband. Music, needlework, pleasant conversation. Reading serious books would only make me seem odd." Julian pulled a book from the shelf, turning it over in his hands without really seeing it. "And yet you continued reading anyway." "What else was there to do? While other girls danced and flirted at balls, I sat in whatever library the hostess had, hiding away with books. It became my refuge, I suppose." For the first time since their marriage, Julian looked directly at her with something approaching real interest. He moved to a chair near hers, not quite close but no longer maintaining that careful distance. They began to talk, tentatively at first like two strangers testing uncertain ground. He spoke of his years in the military, of places he'd seen, the mountains of Portugal, the harsh beauty of Spanish plains. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision, avoiding any mention of battles or blood. Amber shared her own love of learning, how books had been her companions when people were not. She told him about spending 4 seasons in London ballrooms, always the girl no one noticed, the one who disappeared into corners with whatever volume she could find. As the afternoon light faded to dusk, Julian said something that surprised them both. His voice was quiet, almost reflective. "Perhaps society's rejection was not the punishment we thought. Perhaps it was a gift that brought us here, to a place where we might finally be understood." Could it be true? Could two people dismissed by the world find understanding in each other? Amber looked at her husband and saw, for the first time, not the cold stranger from the wedding, but a man who might be as lonely and overlooked as she had always been. What would happen if they stopped hiding from each other? The screaming woke Amber in the darkest hours before dawn. At first, she thought she dreamed it, But then it came again, a man's voice, raw and desperate, shouting words she couldn't quite make out. It was coming from Julian's chambers, just beyond the connecting door. Her heart racing, Amber threw on her dressing gown and rushed into the corridor. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but when she reached Julian's door, she discovered Percival already there, slipping inside with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before. She followed quietly, staying near the doorway. The scene before her made her chest tighten with unexpected pain. Julian sat in a chair by his fire, still dressed in his nightshirt, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. His hands trembled violently, and his eyes stared at something only he could see. He was breathing hard, like a man who'd been running for his life. Percival knelt beside him, speaking in low, steady tones, the kind of voice one might use to calm a frightened horse. "You're home, Your Grace. You're safe at Ashford. The war is over. You're home now." Amber watched as Percival repeated these words again and again, patient and kind, until slowly the terror began to fade from Julian's eyes. When the Duke finally seemed to recognize where he was, shame washed over his face. He looked up and saw Amber standing in the doorway. Something crumbled in his expression then, as if she'd discovered his darkest secret. She left quietly, returning to her chambers with her mind racing. Sleep was impossible now. The next morning, Amber found Percival in the breakfast room. He looked tired but unsurprised when she asked him to explain what she'd witnessed. He poured her tea with steady hands and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned the right to share difficult truths. The war left marks on his Grace that no one can see, but they are there all the same. He has nightmares most nights, terrible ones about things he saw at Talavera and Badajos. Battles where good men died in ways no one should have to witness. Percival stared into his own teacup, his weathered face lined with concern for the man he served. His family thought he should simply put it behind him when he returned. They expected him to resume his place in society, attend balls and dinner parties, act as if nothing had changed. But he couldn't do it. The crowds, the noise, the expectations, it all became unbearable for him. So he came here, where it's quiet and he can breathe. Amber felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Julian's silence wasn't coldness, it was protection against a world that had become too loud, too demanding. His reclusiveness wasn't antisocial behavior, it was survival. He'd built walls not to keep others out, but to keep himself together. "Does he know I saw him last night?" she asked quietly. "He knows, Your Grace. And he's ashamed, though he has no reason to be. Perhaps you might help him understand that." That evening, when Julian appeared for dinner, Amber could see the tension in every line of his body. He was waiting for her to mention what she'd witnessed, bracing himself for pity or judgment or questions he couldn't bear to answer. So she gave him none of those things. Instead, she asked about something she'd noticed during her explorations of the estate, the large glass conservatory behind the house, filled with unusual plants she didn't recognize. Julian looked startled by the question, then cautiously relieved. "Those are medicinal plants I've been cultivating. Studying them gives me something productive to focus on." As he began to describe his work, something remarkable happened. His voice grew animated, his eyes brightened, and the rigid tension in his shoulders eased. He spoke of rare herbs that could ease pain, of plants that helped with sleep and anxiety, of his experiments in crossbreeding varieties to make them hardier for English soil. This was clearly more than just a hobby, it was a passion, perhaps even a calling. "I've been corresponding with botanists across Europe," he explained, warming to his subject. "There's so much we don't yet understand about how plants might help people who suffer from ailments that doctors can't cure with traditional methods." "You're doing important work," Amber said, and she meant it completely. Julian paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her with an expression of such naked surprise and gratitude that it nearly broke her heart. "Thank you," he said quietly. "No one has said that to me in years." How long had this man been starving for simple acknowledgement? How long had he been dismissed and forgotten, his worth measured only by what he could no longer do rather than what he still had to offer? Amber understood that feeling all too well. Perhaps that's what would bind them together in the end, not romance or passion, but the simple recognition that they both deserved to be seen for who they truly were. 3 months had passed since Amber's arrival at Ashford Hall, and in that time, a quiet rhythm had settled over their lives. She and Julian were not lovers, barely even friends in the conventional sense, but something had shifted between them. They spent evenings in the library, sometimes talking, sometimes simply reading in comfortable silence. She'd learned his patterns, his routines, the way he took his morning walks before breakfast and disappeared into his conservatory each afternoon. So when Julian announced at breakfast that he was going hunting in the northern woods, Amber noticed immediately how unusual this was. He rarely ventured beyond the immediate estate grounds, and he'd never mentioned hunting before. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against the table, small signs that he was pushing himself to do something difficult. "Be careful," she said, surprising them both with the genuine concern in her voice. He nodded, something almost like gratitude flickering across his face, and then he was gone. Julian moved through the forest with the silent precision of the soldier he'd once been. Years might have passed since he'd worn a uniform, but his body remembered the training, the discipline, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through countless battles. His rifle rested comfortably in his hands, and his eyes tracked the signs of deer, broken twigs, fresh tracks in the soft earth, the paths they used through the underbrush. The morning was cool and quiet, with mist still clinging to the low places between the trees. He'd forgotten how peaceful this could be, how the solitude of the hunt could settle the constant noise in his mind. For the first time in months, he felt almost like himself again. Then he heard the voices. They were low and urgent, coming from a clearing just ahead. Julian froze instantly, every sense sharpening. Something in the tone, in the careful quietness of those voices, set off alarms in his mind. These were not casual hunters or estate workers. These were men who didn't want to be overheard. Moving with the stealth that had once made him valuable to his regiment, Julian crept closer, using the thick undergrowth as cover. He positioned himself behind a fallen oak where he could hear clearly but remain hidden. What he heard made his blood run cold. "Next Tuesday, when the king visits Hornbridge," a rough voice was saying. "The hunt is the perfect opportunity. His Majesty always rides ahead of his guard, likes to show off his horsemanship. That's our window." Julian's heart hammered in his chest. The king? Visiting Lord Hornbridge's estate? He knew Hornbridge's lands bordered his own, but he'd heard nothing of a royal visit. Then again, he deliberately cut himself off from all society news, all London gossip. He'd wanted nothing to do with that world. A second voice responded, this one educated and refined, the accent of an officer or gentleman. "Thompson has provided the maps of the estate, marked the best positions. 3 shooters in the tree line overlooking the north field where they'll flush the game. Gallagher, your men know their positions." Gallagher. Julian knew that name. Solomon Gallagher had been a captain in the peninsula, cashiered out for excessive brutality toward his own men and Spanish civilians. A dangerous man, cruel and ambitious, who'd blamed everyone but himself for his disgrace. "My men know their business," Gallagher replied with ugly confidence. 3 shots, 3 different angles. Even if one misses, the others won't. The king will be dead before his guards can react. Julian remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing. His military training had taught him to stay calm in crisis, to observe and gather information before acting. He forced himself to listen, to minimize every detail. The educated voice continued, Thompson will ensure the investigation points toward radicals, perhaps Irish sympathizers. By the time they realize the truth, we'll have consolidated our positions. The Prince Regent will need strong advisors in the chaos that follows. So this was treason at the highest level. Not just an assassination, but a carefully planned conspiracy involving someone from the Treasury and a disgraced officer with mercenaries at his command. They spoke of timing, of escape routes, of payments and promises. They discussed which members of Parliament might be sympathetic to their cause once the king was dead and panic set in. Julian committed every word to memory, every name mentioned, every detail of their plan. This was exactly like gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, except the enemy now threatened his own sovereign on English soil. The conversation continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. They discussed weapons, positioning, the schedule of the royal hunt, even what weather would be best for their purposes. Julian learned that Thompson had access to the king's private correspondence, that Gallagher had assembled a dozen experienced shooters, that they had supporters in London ready to exploit the chaos. Finally, the men began to disperse. Julian heard them moving off in different directions, their footsteps fading into the forest. He waited, counting slowly to 100, then 200. He couldn't risk being discovered now. If they realized someone had overheard their plans, they would either accelerate their timeline or disappear entirely, and the king would die without warning. When he was certain they were gone, Julian rose slowly from his hiding place. His legs had cramped from staying motionless so long, and his mind was racing faster than it had in years. The old instincts, the ones he thought he'd lost forever, came flooding back. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He made his way back through the forest, moving carefully, alert for any sign that he was being watched or followed. His thoughts churned through possibilities and plans. He would need evidence, not just his word. He would need to act quickly but carefully. And he would need help, though he wasn't sure yet from whom. As Ashford Hall came into view across the moorland, Julian realized something that both terrified and exhilarated him. For 3 years, he'd hidden here, convinced he had nothing left to offer, that he was too broken to matter. But now, when his king and country needed him most, he discovered that perhaps he wasn't as useless as he'd believed. The question was, could he do what needed to be done? Could he step back into that world of danger and duty? And if he succeeded, what would it cost him, an Amber, in the end? Julian returned to Ashford Hall that afternoon with his mind working through strategies and possibilities like the intelligence officer he'd once been. He found Percival in the estate office and closed the door firmly behind him. The steward looked up from his ledgers, immediately sensing something had changed. "I need you to confirm something for me, and I need absolute discretion," Julian said, his voice carrying a command it hadn't held in years. "Find out quietly whether King George is planning to visit Lord Hornbridge's estate. Use your connections with the household staff there, but be subtle about it. No one can know I'm asking." Percival's eyes widened, but he asked no questions. He simply nodded and set down his pen. "I'll have an answer by tomorrow morning, Your Grace." Julian spent the rest of that day preparing. He retrieved items he'd packed away years ago, dark clothing suitable for moving unseen, a spyglass from his military days, maps of the surrounding estates. He felt something awakening inside him that he'd thought dead: purpose, clarity, the sharp focus that had once made him valuable to his regiment. Over the next 4 days, Julian became someone he barely recognized. Each morning before dawn, he would slip out of the house and make his way toward Hornbridge's estate and the nearby village. He moved through the countryside like a ghost, using every skill he'd learned during the war: how to observe without being seen, how to track men without leaving traces, how to piece together a conspiracy from fragments and patterns. He discovered that Gallagher had taken rooms at the village inn under a false name, along with 6 other men who claimed to be looking for agricultural work. But Julian recognized military bearing when he saw it. These were soldiers, experienced and disciplined, not farm laborers. He watched them survey the land around Hornbridge's estate, noting positions and sight lines exactly as trained marksmen would. On the 3rd day, Julian observed a well-dressed gentleman arrive at the inn in an unmarked carriage. The man carried a leather case and met with Gallagher in private. When he emerged an hour later, the case was noticeably lighter. Julian followed the carriage at a distance and confirmed what he'd suspected. It belonged to Richard Thompson, a mid-level Treasury official whose access to government correspondence would make him invaluable to conspirators. Julian mapped everything meticulously: the positions Gallagher's men were scouting, their routines, their supply lines. He noted which servants at Hornbridge's estate seemed to be in Thompson's pay, which routes the conspirators used to avoid detection. It was exhausting work that required him to stay alert for hours, to move silently through terrain, to think 3 steps ahead. Skills he'd thought he'd lost came flooding back with startling clarity. But the work was taking its toll. The nightmares intensified, fueled by the stress and the memories of war that this covert operation stirred up. Julian slept little and ate less, driven by the knowledge that a king's life hung in the balance. Amber noticed everything. She saw how Julian disappeared each morning before breakfast and returned late in the afternoon, exhausted and distracted. She noticed the mud on boots he tried to hide, the maps spread across his study desk that he quickly covered when she passed. Most of all, she saw the change in his eyes. The haunted look was still there, but now it was mixed with something else: determination, purpose, and fear. On the 4th evening, she found him in his study, staring at a hand-drawn map covered in notations. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hadn't touched the dinner that had been sent up hours ago. She closed the door behind her and stood there until he looked up. "Julian, what's happening? And please don't tell me it's nothing, because I can see that it's very much something." He stared at her for a long moment, clearly debating with himself. She watched the internal struggle play across his face, the instinct to protect her through silence warring with something else. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Amber. What I'm about to tell you could put us both in danger." She sat without hesitation, her heart pounding but her gaze steady. Julian told her everything. The voices in the woods, the conspiracy he'd uncovered, the assassination plot against the king. He showed her his maps, explained what he'd observed over the past 4 days. He spoke quickly and precisely, laying out facts like a military report. When he finished, the room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. "You must report this to the authorities immediately," Amber said, her voice urgent. "Send word to the Home Secretary, to the King's Guards, to someone who can stop this." "I will, but I need proof they'll believe. Do you understand what I am to them? A reclusive duke whom society considers half-mad, who hasn't shown his face in London in 3 years. If I send a letter claiming there's a plot against the king based on overheard conversation and a few days of observation, they'll dismiss it as the ravings of a damaged mind." He stood and moved to the window, his back to her. "I need evidence, documents, correspondence, something concrete that proves this conspiracy exists. Otherwise, the king rides to his death and no one will believe the warning came from me." Amber stood as well, moving to stand beside him. When she spoke, her voice was firm and clear. "Then we'll get the proof together. Tell me what you need." Julian turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Amber, this is dangerous. These men have already committed treason. If they discover someone is investigating them, they won't hesitate to kill." "I understand that. But you can't do this alone, and you know it. You need someone who can move through the village without drawing attention, someone who can talk to servants and gather information in ways you cannot. She met his eyes directly. I've spent my entire life being overlooked and invisible. For once, let that be an advantage. For the first time since their marriage, Julian looked at his wife and truly saw her. Not the plain girl society had dismissed, not the convenient solution to a practical problem, but a woman of quiet courage and unexpected strength. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. "We'll need to be extremely careful," he said slowly. "If Thompson or Gallagher suspects anything, they'll either accelerate their plans or vanish entirely." "Then teach me what to look for," Amber replied. "Show me how to be invisible in a way that matters." As they bent over the maps together, planning their next moves, neither of them realized they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. They were no longer two separate people living parallel lives. They were becoming partners, bound together by something far more powerful than a marriage contract: shared purpose, mutual trust, and the knowledge that they were all that stood between a king and his assassins. Would they succeed? Or would their courage lead them both into a trap from which there could be no escape? If you're enjoying this tale of love, courage, and intrigue, please give this video a like. It truly helps me bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's see what happens next. Amber proved to be far more resourceful than either of them had anticipated. Over the next 3 days, she became exactly what she'd promised: invisible in a way that mattered. She visited the village with Rose, her maid, under the guise of shopping for household supplies and fabrics. No one paid attention to the plain duchess who smiled politely and asked quiet questions while examining ribbons and thread. But Amber was listening to everything. She befriended the innkeeper's wife, a talkative woman who loved to gossip about the new guests. She learned that the men staying at the inn claimed to be looking for agricultural work, but they had far too much money for laborious and kept strange hours. She spoke with servants from Hornbridge's estate who came to the village market, carefully steering conversations toward the upcoming royal visit that everyone was whispering about. One particularly valuable piece of information came from a young scullery maid who'd been hired temporarily at Hornbridge Hall. The girl mentioned that a treasury gentleman named Thompson had visited 3 times in the past week, always meeting privately with Lord Hornbridge's steward and asking detailed questions about the estate's hunting grounds. Each evening, Amber would return to Ashford Hall and share everything she'd learned with Julian. They would sit in his study, piecing together the conspiracy like a puzzle, each new fragment of information confirming what Julian had overheard in the woods. Meanwhile, Julian took on the more dangerous work. On the 6th night of their investigation, he waited until well past midnight, then made his way to the village inn. The building was dark and quiet, with only a single candle burning in the common room where the night porter dozed at his post. Julian moved like a shadow through the back entrance, up the servants' stairs to the 2nd floor where Thompson had taken a room. The lock was simple enough to pick with tools he'd acquired years ago and never thought to use again. Inside Thompson's room, Julian worked quickly and methodically. He found what he needed in a leather case hidden beneath the bed: maps of Hornbridge's estate with positions marked in red ink, correspondence discussing the enterprise, and most damning of all, a letter from Gallagher detailing the assassination plan in explicit terms. Julian couldn't risk taking the originals, so he copied everything by the light of a shielded candle, his hand moving swiftly across the paper. Every sound from the hallway made his heart race, but his training held. Within 20 minutes, he had everything he needed. He left the room exactly as he'd found it and disappeared back into the night. The next morning, Julian drafted an urgent message to the Home Secretary. He invoked his military record, his title, and the seriousness of what he'd discovered. He included detailed copies of the documents, maps showing the conspirators' positions, and a comprehensive account of everything he and Amber had uncovered. He sent it through official military channels, marked with the highest priority. The response came faster than he'd dared hope. Within a day, 2 men arrived at Ashford Hall in an unmarked carriage. They were quiet, professional, and carried themselves with the understated authority of the king's personal security. The senior agent, a man named Caldwell with sharp grey eyes, listened intently as Julian presented his evidence. The king's visit to Lord Hornbridge was meant to be completely private, Caldwell said, examining the copied maps with growing concern. Only His Majesty's inner circle and a handful of trusted staff knew the details. The fact that these conspirators have this level of information confirms there's been a serious breach at the highest levels. He looked up at Julian with new respect. Your Grace, you've done your country a tremendous service. We need to act quickly, but we must also be strategic. If we simply arrest these men now, we won't know how far the conspiracy reaches or who else is involved. They spent hours formulating a plan. The king's visit would proceed as scheduled, but his guard would be significantly reinforced with agents disguised as beaters and servants. Additional marksmen would be positioned to counter Gallagher's shooters. The conspirators would be allowed to get into position, then trapped in the act. We need someone who knows the terrain intimately and has observed where these men plan to position themselves, Caldwell said, looking directly at Julian. Your Grace, would you be willing to accompany the king's hunt as a guide? We need your eyes and your expertise. Julian felt Amber's hand find his under the table, squeezing gently. He thought of all the reasons to refuse, the danger, the nightmares, the fact that he'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation. But he also thought of a king who would die without warning, of a country thrown into chaos, of the men who'd served beside him who'd given everything for their sovereign. I'll do whatever is necessary, Julian said quietly. Amber's hand tightened in his, and he knew she understood what this would cost him. But she also knew, as he did, that some things mattered more than personal peace. Some things were worth the risk. The morning of the royal hunt dawned cold and clear, with frost still clinging to the grass as the sun rose over Hornbridge's estate. Julian stood in his dressing room, fastening the buttons of his riding coat with hands that were steadier than he'd expected. He caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Gone was the haunted recluse who'd hidden at Ashford Hall for 3 years. In his place stood the officer he'd once been, focused, determined, ready. Amber appeared in the doorway, still in her dressing gown. She'd barely slept, he knew, spending the night worrying about what this day would bring. She crossed the room and adjusted his cravat with gentle hands, her eyes never leaving his face. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said quietly. "Promise me you'll come home." Julian covered her hands with his own. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to return to you. Whatever happens today, Amber, you should know that these past months with you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. Peace. A reason to believe I might still be worth something." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "You've always been worth something, Julian. I'm just glad you're finally beginning to see it." He left Ashford Hall as the sun climbed higher, riding toward Hornbridge's estate with Caldwell and 2 other agents. The morning was beautiful in that sharp, clear way that made everything seem more vivid, more real. Julian's senses were heightened, every detail etching itself into his memory, the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground, the smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys, the way his breath misted in the cold air. When they arrived at Hornbridge's grand estate, the hunting party was already assembling. Nobles and gentlemen in fine riding clothes gathered near the stables, servants rushed about with guns and equipment, and beaters prepared to flush game from the woods. But Julian's trained eye picked out the differences, the extra guards positioned strategically around the grounds, the agents disguised as servants, the military precision hidden beneath the veneer of leisure. And then the king arrived. King George IV was a large man in his 60s, dressed magnificently for the hunt in deep green velvet. Despite his age and increasing infirmity, he still carried himself with royal bearing. Lord Hornbridge made the introductions, and when he reached Julian, the king's expression shifted to one of genuine interest. "The Duke of Ashford. We wondered what became of you after Tolliver. You served with distinction in the peninsula, as we recall. Your commander spoke highly of your intelligence work." Julian bowed deeply. "Your Majesty does me great honor by remembering. I've been managing my estates in Yorkshire these past years." The king's eyes were shrewd despite his reputation for frivolity. "Indeed. And now you've chosen to emerge from your seclusion to join our hunt. How fortuitous." There was meaning in those words. The king knew. Caldwell had briefed him on everything, and His Majesty had chosen to proceed anyway, trusting in Julian's intelligence and the protection his agents would provide. It was an act of remarkable courage or remarkable faith, perhaps both. The hunting party moved out across Hornbridge's extensive grounds, heading toward the wooded areas where game would be plentiful. Julian rode near the front of the group, positioned close to the king but not so close as to draw attention. His eyes constantly scanned the tree lines, the high ground, every position a marksman might choose. He spotted the first one within 20 minutes. A slight movement in the trees to the north, right where Julian's maps had predicted. A man in dark clothing, positioned with clear sight lines to where the path would pass. Julian caught Caldwell's eye and touched his hat brim once, the signal they'd agreed upon. Caldwell nodded imperceptibly and signaled to his men. They continued forward, appearing relaxed and unaware, but Julian could feel the tension coiling tighter with each step. His heart hammered against his ribs, and his hands wanted to shake, but he forced himself to breathe deeply and stay focused. This was no different from dozens of dangerous situations he'd navigated during the war. Except it was different, because failure today meant his king would die. The party reached the clearing where, according to tradition, the king would ride ahead to demonstrate his horsemanship before the actual hunt began. It was exactly the moment the conspirators had chosen, when His Majesty would be separated from his guards, exposed and vulnerable. The king spurred his horse forward, and Julian's entire body tensed. His eyes swept the tree line, marking positions. One shooter to the north, one to the east, and there, a third to the west, exactly as Gallagher's letter had described. 3 angles of attack, making it nearly impossible to miss. Time seemed to slow as Julian saw the first shooter rise slightly, bringing his rifle to bear. The morning sunlight caught on the barrel for just an instant, a flash of metal that most would never notice. Julian didn't think. He acted on pure instinct and training. He spurred his horse forward with explosive force, putting himself between the king and the shooters. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, the sound cracking across the clear morning air like thunder. Julian felt the impact as one bullet tore through his coat sleeve, so close he felt the heat of it against his skin. Another shot kicked up dirt just beside his horse's hooves, and the third went wide as his sudden movement disrupted the shooter's aim. The king's horse reared in alarm, but His Majesty controlled it with the skill of a lifelong horseman. In the same instant, Caldwell's agents exploded into action. The royal guards converged on the king, surrounding him with their bodies and weapons. Hidden soldiers emerged from positions Julian had helped them choose, moving with military precision toward the shooters. The conspirators realized too late that they'd been trapped. Gallagher, positioned in the northern tree line, tried to reload for another shot but found himself surrounded by armed men. His mercenaries in the other positions fared no better. They were caught in a carefully orchestrated net, with no escape routes that hadn't been blocked. Julian wheeled his horse around, his heart still racing, scanning for any threat they might have missed. His military instincts had taken over completely, overriding fear and doubt with cold tactical clarity. But as the adrenaline began to fade, his hands started to shake. The arrests happened with brutal efficiency. Gallagher was dragged from his position, cursing and struggling. His men were seized one by one, their weapons confiscated, their hands bound. At the estate gates, Richard Thompson had attempted to flee in a carriage but found his way blocked by soldiers. He was pulled from the vehicle, his face white with terror as he realized the conspiracy had been completely exposed. The clearing had transformed from a hunting ground to a battlefield in mere moments. Servants and nobles who'd been unaware of the danger stood in shocked silence, trying to understand what had just happened. Only those who'd known of the plot moved with purpose, securing the area and gathering evidence. The king, once the immediate danger had passed, rode his horse calmly back to where Julian sat, still trembling slightly from the aftershocks of action. His Majesty's face was grave but composed, showing the royal training that allowed him to maintain dignity even in crisis. "You've saved our life, Duke of Ashford," the king said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent clearing. "And at no small risk to your own. That bullet came near enough to kiss you, by the look of your coat." Julian looked down and saw the torn fabric of his sleeve, the long rent where the bullet had passed within inches of his flesh. If his timing had been even slightly different, if his horse had been a fraction slower, he would be dead or dying now. "I did only what duty required, Your Majesty," Julian replied, though his voice was rougher than he'd intended. "Duty," the king repeated, a slight smile touching his lips. "Is that what you call throwing yourself in front of loaded rifles? We call it extraordinary courage, Duke. You've proven yourself a true servant of the crown." Lord Hornbridge approached, his face ashen with shock and horror. "Your Majesty, I swear I knew nothing of this treachery. My steward, he must have been corrupted by that treasury devil Thompson. I am mortified that such evil was plotted on my lands." The king waved away his protestations with imperial patience. "We do not doubt your loyalty, Hornbridge. Evil men can deceive even the most vigilant. What matters is that the plot has been foiled and the traitors will face justice." Caldwell appeared at Julian's side, his expression showing rare approval. "Your Grace, your intelligence, and your actions today have prevented a catastrophe. The Home Secretary will want a full report, but please know that you've done your country an immeasurable service." As the conspirators were led away in chains and order began to be restored, Julian felt the familiar symptoms beginning: the tightness in his chest, the way sounds seemed too loud, the memories of other battles threatening to overwhelm him. He'd pushed himself hard today, further than he'd gone since the war, and his mind was beginning to rebel against the stress. But he'd succeeded. The king was alive. The traitors were captured. And for the first time in 3 years, Julian Cromwell had proven to himself and to the world that he was still capable of standing when it mattered most. Now he just needed to get home to Amber before the inevitable collapse came. Because he knew it would come: the nightmares, the shaking, the overwhelming weight of what he'd just done. But at least this time, he wouldn't face it alone. How would the king reward Julian's courage? And how would London society react when news of the reclusive duke's heroism spread through the ballrooms and drawing rooms? Everything was about to change for Julian and Amber, but would it be the new beginning they hoped for, or would it bring new challenges neither of them expected? The days following the thwarted assassination were difficult for Julian. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more intense than they'd been in months. He would wake in the darkness, drenched in sweat, seeing not just the old horrors of war but the new ones: the flash of rifle barrels, the crack of shots, the moment when death had passed within inches of his body. But this time, Amber was there. She didn't try to fix him or tell him everything would be fine. She simply sat with him in those dark hours, her presence steady and calm, reminding him that he was home and safe. Sometimes she would read to him until the shaking stopped. Sometimes she would just hold his hand in silence. It was exactly what he needed. 2 weeks after the incident at Hornbridge, A royal messenger arrived at Ashford Hall bearing a summons sealed with the king's own seal. Amber was requested to appear at St. James's Palace in 3 days' time. Along with the summons came a large box containing a gown of deep sapphire silk, finer than anything Amber had ever seen, let alone worn. The fabric shimmered in the light, and the cut was elegant and fashionable in a way her simple dresses had never been. "The king himself requested your presence," the messenger explained. "His Majesty wishes the Duchess of Ashford to attend a ceremony honoring your husband's service to the crown." The journey to London felt surreal. Amber wore the sapphire gown with its matching pelisse, and beside her, Julian sat silent in formal dress, his expression unreadable. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands occasionally clenched. Returning to London, to society, to the world that had dismissed him, this was perhaps harder than facing the assassins had been. St. James's Palace was magnificent, all gilt and grandeur, filled with people whose names Amber recognized from the society pages she'd once read in despair. But now they looked at her differently. Whispers followed her progress through the halls, but these whispers carried a different tone than the ones she remembered. "That's the Duchess of Ashford. Her husband foiled the assassination plot. They say he saved the king's life at great personal risk. Imagine, we all thought him merely reclusive, but he was simply waiting for the moment his country needed him most." The ceremony took place in the palace's grandest stateroom, with soaring ceilings and walls covered in portraits of monarchs past. Assembled peers and ministers filled the space, along with members of the royal family and the highest nobility. Amber was given a place of honor near the front, where she could see everything clearly. The king entered with full ceremony, and the room fell silent. King George IV, dressed in magnificent robes of state, commanded attention despite his age and bulk. He moved to a throne-like chair at the center of the room, and Julian was called forward. Amber watched her husband walk toward the king with his military bearing restored, his back straight, his steps measured. But she could also see the slight tremor in his hands, the tightness around his eyes. This moment cost him something, standing before all these people, accepting attention he'd spent years avoiding. The king's voice rang out clearly across the chamber. "Julian Cromwell, Duke of Ashford, approach and kneel." Julian knelt, and the king lifted the blue velvet ribbon and gold medallion of the Order of the Garter, England's highest honor, an order so exclusive it was limited to the sovereign and only 24 knights. Amber felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the king place it around Julian's neck. For loyalty beyond measure, for courage in the face of treason, and for service to the crown that exemplifies the highest traditions of English nobility, we bestow upon you this honor. Rise, Sir Knight, and take your place among England's greatest defenders." The room erupted in applause. Julian rose, the ribbon and medallion gleaming against his dark coat, and his eyes immediately sought Amber's across the crowded chamber. When their gazes met, she saw something that broke her heart and mended it at the same time. Not pride or triumph, but relief that she was there, that he hadn't faced this moment alone, that someone who truly knew him had witnessed this recognition he'd never sought. Later, in the privacy of their carriage as they left London behind, Julian held the medallion in his hands, turning it over as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. "I don't know that I deserve this," he said quietly. "You saved the king's life," Amber replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I did what any loyal subject would do." "No." She placed her hand over his, stilling his restless fingers. "You did what a true hero does. You risked everything when no one would have blamed you for staying silent, for remaining hidden at Ashford. And I am honored beyond words to be your wife." It was the first time she'd said such words, and she meant them with her whole heart. Julian's hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. For the first time since their marriage, he held on and didn't let go. They rode home like that, hands clasped between them, Two people who'd finally found in each other exactly what they'd been missing all along. The Duchess of Carrington's ball was the event of the London season, held in a ballroom so magnificent it seemed designed to make mortals feel small. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors, and everywhere Amber looked, she saw the cream of society dressed in their finest silks and jewels. A year ago, she would have felt invisible here, a plain sparrow among peacocks. But tonight, everything was different. She wore a gown of silver silk that caught the candlelight with every movement, another gift from the grateful king. Beside her, Julian stood tall in formal evening dress, the blue ribbon and gold medallion of the Order of the Garter displayed prominently across his chest. He was tense, she could feel it, but he'd chosen to come. For her, she realized. He'd faced his fear of society and returned to this world because she would be at his side. The whispers began the moment they entered, rippling through the crowd like wind through grass. But these whispers were nothing like the cruel ones Amber remembered from her failed seasons. "That's the Duke of Ashford, the king's champion. They say he discovered the assassination plot and saved His Majesty's life at great personal risk. Imagine, we all thought him merely reclusive, but he was simply a hero waiting for the moment his country needed him. His Grace foiled the entire conspiracy practically single-handedly. The king himself bestowed the Order of the Garter." Charlotte Cromwell materialized from the crowd, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of warm interest that fooled no one who knew her. Gone was the brittle disdain she'd shown at their wedding. Now she radiated calculated charm, already thinking of how Julian's newfound status could benefit her and Frederick. "Julian, how wonderful to see you back in society where you belong. You simply must introduce me to the Home Secretary. Frederick insists we cultivate connections with the current administration, and given your recent service to the Crown, your recommendation would be invaluable." Julian's response was simple and final. "No, Charlotte. My wife and I prefer to avoid political maneuvering. We came tonight to honor the Duchess of Carrington's invitation, nothing more." Charlotte's smile froze, then cracked slightly. She wasn't accustomed to being refused, especially not by the family member she'd always considered beneath her notice. She recovered with practiced grace and retreated, but Amber saw the flash of frustration in her eyes. Across the ballroom, Amber spotted Lady Rose Ashbury, one of the celebrated beauties who'd ignored her completely during 4 painful seasons. Rose was staring at them now with something that looked remarkably like envy, whispering urgently to her companions. Other young women clustered nearby, suddenly eager for introduction to the Duchess of Ashford, hoping to catch the attention of the king's champion and his wife. The irony wasn't lost on Amber. She was the same person she'd always been, plain, quiet, unremarkable by society's standards. But now they saw her differently, valued her differently, simply because her husband had become someone they couldn't ignore. When the orchestra began playing the final waltz of the evening, Julian did something unprecedented. He took Amber's hand and led her to the center of the ballroom floor, right where everyone could see them. The crowd parted to make way, and whispers of surprise and approval followed in their wake. "I am not practiced at this," Julian said quietly as they took their positions. His hand was warm at her waist, steady despite the hundreds of eyes watching them. "Nor am I," Amber admitted, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I spent 4 seasons sitting out dances, remember? Then we'll be imperfect together, as we've always been." He looked at her directly, and she saw in his eyes something that took her breath away, genuine affection, maybe even the beginning of love. "You've never asked me to be anything other than what I am, Amber. You saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself. You've shown me that quiet courage matters more than easy charm, that steadiness is more valuable than flash. I am grateful beyond words that you're my Duchess." They began to move, and perhaps their steps weren't perfectly graceful, Perhaps they weren't the most elegant couple on the floor. But something in the way they looked at each other, in the gentle care with which they moved together, made them magnetic. Around them, London's elite watched and whispered. The Duchess of Ashford, wife to the King's champion. She must have known his true worth all along, even when the rest of us were blind to it. They say theirs is a true love match, that she married him when he had nothing to offer but himself, and that's exactly what made them perfect for each other. As the music swelled toward its conclusion, Amber realized the profound truth of her situation. She wasn't the envy of London because her husband had become a hero or because she now wore expensive gowns and attended royal ceremonies. She was the envy of London because she'd found something rare and precious, a partnership built on mutual respect, on truly seeing and valuing each other's authentic selves. "Julian," she said softly as the final notes faded, "I believe we've both found exactly where we belong." He smiled, that rare genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "At last, we're truly seen. Not for what society wanted us to be, but for who we actually are." And in that moment, surrounded by the very society that had once dismissed them both as failures and disappointments, Amber Cartwright and Julian Cromwell stood together, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked, but finally, beautifully known for exactly who they'd always been. Thank you so much for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If this story made you smile, brought a tear to your eye, or reminded you that true worth is found not in appearance or social standing but in courage and integrity, we'd be honored if you liked this video and left us a comment. Share it with someone who loves a good romance about two overlooked souls finding each other. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for supporting our storytelling. Your support keeps us going and helps us create more stories full of love, redemption, and unexpected heroism. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new tale. And at the end of this video, another story awaits. Click and be surprised by more romance, courage, and unforgettable characters. Thank you for being here.